What if I told you that the story of Cinderella means nothing if Cinderella is not a real historical figure, a real young woman pulled in a coach while wearing a glass slipper, and the coach turned into a pumpkin at midnight, and you had to believe that all that really happened, that the coach turned into a pumpkin, and the horses, the beautiful team of snow white horses that were pulling this magnificent coach, turned back into rats or mice. This young woman had a fairy godmother, and it all actually happened. And if you don't believe that, then the story of Cinderella has no meaning. Anyone who says that Cinderella didn't really live and go through all of that is taking away the meaning of the story of Cinderella or Jack and the Beanstalk. It has no message for us unless you really believe in your heart that Jack got some magic beans in exchange for the family's milk cow, or however the story went. He got those magic beans and they really sprouted into a beanstalk that went all the way up to a castle in the clouds inhabited by a giant, and Jack really climbed that literal beanstalk. If you don't believe that, then the story has no meaning. Obviously, these are fairy tales. These are specific fairy tales. And they're specific fairy tales from basically the Western European culture. Beauty and the Beast is French. I don't know, Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk might be English. What I'm saying is, everybody knows they're fairy tales. Nobody is building their whole life on the proposition that Jack was a literal historical young man or boy who climbed up a literal beanstalk and found a literal castle in the clouds inhabited by a literal giant, and then brought back, the things that he found up there. Nobody expects you to believe that. And if I were to say, listen, all the fairy tales from all the other cultures around the world, because guess what? There's fairy tales around the world, and they follow similar patterns around the world, which is very interesting. They are related to the myths. There's a story from Finland and from Eastern Europe, Estonia, and maybe it goes as far as Russia, of a woman. Sometimes her name in Finnish is Mieleki, and there's also a goddess, a forest goddess, but she has 9 sons, or she talks in the 3 daughters are talking about what they would do to get married, and the youngest one says, well, I'll have 9 children. Well, that's celestial. There are gods who have 9 mothers, like Heimdall in the Norse myths. It's celestial. I can show it's celestial. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the proponents of Jack and the Beanstalk, who follow a literal Jack and believe in a literal Jack who climbed up a literal beanstalk that grew out of magic beans, says, listen, our fairy tales are literally true, but the fairy tales from other cultures, those are all just fairy tales. And in fact, we need to stop people from listening to those fairy tales so that they accept Jack or Cinderella as being true, but not the maiden who eventually has 9 children and then gets thrown into a barrel with one of the surviving children or 2 of the surviving children put into a barrel into the sea. That's a pattern that we find around the world of babies being put into barrels, or babies with their mother, like in the story of Perseus. But baby Moses gets put into a basket and put into the river. The babies getting put into the water are found around the world. There's a hero named Karna in the Mahabharata, the ancient Sanskrit text of India, Mahabharata. Baby Karna gets put into a river. There's other babies who get put into the river. Sargon of Akkad says he was put into the water in a basket. I've shown that Maui was also cast into the sea foam by his mother. It's around the world. There's a leech child baby in the myths of ancient Japan who gets put into the sea. This is a pattern around the world, just like Mieleki and her 9 children. But let's just say that the proponents of the Jack and the Beanstalk story believe that their fairy tale is literal and nobody else's. Everybody else's fairy tales are evil. Well, obviously that's ridiculous. What am I referring to here? The Bible stories are part of the world's ancient mythology. They are a collection, just like the collection of fairy tales, like the Mother Goose fairy tales or the Grimm's fairy tales. They're collected up, and then they've been misinterpreted as these stories, these myths, are literal, and they don't have any meaning if they're not literal. And you've got to believe them literally. And if you don't believe in a literal Moses or a literal Jesus, then you're trying to take away the meaning of these stories and you're insulting somebody. No, it is wrong to take them literally. They are myths that have profound messages for us, just like the fairy tales have messages for us, but nobody expects to take the fairy tales literally. The Bible stories that were collected up into these different canons, all around the same period of time, by the way, have been deliberately misinterpreted as being literal. It was a deliberate fraud in the creation of these literalist biblical religions, and I can prove that they are metaphorical. I have shown beyond any doubt that the figures of Moses or Abraham or Jesus and his 12 disciples or the 12 children of Jacob Israel, all those stories are based on the stars. The crossing of the Red Sea, based on the stars. I've proven it beyond any doubt. Jesus and his 12 disciples, those stories, the texts of Revelation, those are based on the stars. They're all celestial metaphor, and they were originally understood as not being literal. And we can prove that these esoteric, profound stories were deliberately misused and forced into being literal by the creators of a fraudulent system. We can look at the letters written by Paul, who says in his letters things like, why are you chasing after a flesh and blood Jesus? That's like trying to chase after a flesh and blood Cinderella or a flesh and blood Mother Goose. It is false. And Paul says, hey, these literalizers, these fleshly Jesus perpetrators, they might even take my words and try and twist them. He says this in his letters. You can look it up in the Bible. They might take my letters to you. You watch out for them because they are deceptive. They are deceivers, and they will even create letters as if I wrote them and try and prove their position and try and act as if I am a proponent of a flesh and blood Jesus when that is absolutely not what I'm teaching. These stories are about something different than a historical, literal figure. And yet, basically, what we today think of as the West is built upon these hijacked stories. People will say, oh, the West is biblical people who are built on Christianity or Judaism. Those are mistaken. The West descends from cultures that have multiple gods and goddesses. Ancient Egypt, multiple gods and goddesses. Ancient Greece, multiple gods and goddesses. Ancient Rome had multiple gods and goddesses. The peoples of Europe all had ancient traditions given to them of their own gods and goddesses. There are Celtic gods and goddesses. There are the Druidic and other peoples that were in France and modern areas of modern day France, or the Germanic gods and goddesses, or the Norse gods and goddesses. All the people of the earth have been given traditions. Christianity has hijacked those, literalist Christianity, and stamped them out and said, you have to believe in a literal interpretation of these biblical stories. It's as mistaken and wrong, and it's actually not just a mistake. It's not an honest mistake. The letters of Paul show that he was battling against people who knew better and who were willing to hijack his letters and try and bring him into support of their flesh and blood in misinterpretation. The ancient stories of the Bible are beautiful, esoteric myth, just like the other myths all around the world, but then they were hijacked deliberately to create this biblical literalism, and that project hijacked the West. When you take them literally, you invert their message. You end up with a wrong message. It's just as bad as taking a fairy tale literally and then saying, well, we got to believe in the 3 little talking pigs and the big bad wolf, and you got to watch out for a big bad wolf that will come and blow your house down. Like, you're going to get the wrong message if you take it literally. And by taking the Bible stories literally, their beautiful messages have been turned on their heads. It's as bizarre as taking a fairy tale literally. When you take the myths literally, when you try and perpetrate that and force it on people at the point of a sword, you're going to really invert their message. And it is on display now. That hijacking project that hijacked the ancient wisdom of the West, the Roman Empire was worshiping gods and goddesses. The Greeks were worshiping gods and goddesses. The Norse were worshiping gods and goddesses. The West was hijacked by this biblical literalist project that then inverted the message, and it is on display now. The horrific nature of that inversion is on display now. I have already spoken out in many videos about what is going on in the absolute war crimes and genocide that is being perpetrated in historic Palestine right now. The slaughter of men, women, and children in Gaza, in the West Bank, now it's expanding into Lebanon, by the so-called State of Israel, the so-called Jewish state. That is a product of taking these stories literally. The argument that this land was promised to the descendants of Abraham, supposedly by these texts, the whole founding of that project, and it was a cynical British Empire project, was based on this idea that the land belongs to these people who were there first. It's completely false. Moses is a constellation, and I can show that. The stories about coming into the promised land are based on the stars. I can show that. I have shown that. I've written thousands of pages with hundreds and hundreds of illustrations and star charts to prove that. I've spoken against this genocide many times. There's many others who are speaking against it, but my particular angle on this whole problem is I can prove that the biblical, so-called biblical support is false. It is false. And it is being supported primarily by evangelicals in the United States. This genocide is not an Israeli genocide. This is a U.S. genocide. It's a U.S. genocide. Israel does not have the ammunition. I've already said this many times. Israel does not have the munitions to perpetrate what they've been perpetrating for over a year now without supplies from the United States. The criminals who've taken over the United States are making this happen, and it is criminal. I'm a graduate of West Point. I'm a graduate of Ranger School. I'm a graduate of the U.S. Army's Advanced Officer Training. I've been given extensive classes about you don't shoot noncombatants. You don't shoot prisoners of war. They're noncombatants now. But what's going on in Gaza is the deliberate targeting of children, women, absolutely destroying hospitals, killing medics, killing journalists, deliberately killing journalists. Those are war crimes. We were taught the distinction. It's very clear. The U.S. is enabling war crimes and a genocide. We're not even supposed to be allowed to say genocide now and get in trouble. It's obviously a genocide, but it is being supported enthusiastically by some evangelicals, by many evangelicals. There is a group called Christians United for Israel, which claims to have 10 million members. 10 million members. It's primarily a U.S.-based group, and it is based on this lie that the Bible gives Israel to the Jewish people.
For the past year, Israel has been fighting our shared enemies to defend our shared values and to ensure its very existence. As Israel fights this seventh front war, take comfort, because we know with certainty how this war will end.
For the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has already promised to intervene on their behalf. The Word of God declares in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 7, quote, "The Lord shall cause your enemies to rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you one way and will flee before you 7 ways. In the meantime, we must do all that we can to help in this righteous cause."
By the time you hear this message, we know the realities on the ground will have changed.
10 million people, that's 3% of the population of the United States. If the United States has 300 million people, 10 million people is 3% of that population. That's a huge number of people supporting and giving money the support of a state that is committing genocide. Clearly, plainly committing genocide, and yet they are backing it up or supporting it with these misinterpretations of the biblical text. I have spoken with evangelicals about the genocide that's going on, and you know what one of them told me? One of them looked me in the eye and said, well, you know, when the children of Israel, when Moses led them out of Egypt and through the Exodus and the wanderings in the desert, when they were finally allowed to go into the promised land, Moses didn't get to go, but they were commanded to kill every man, woman, and child, and they didn't do that, and that's why it's going on today. What? You're taking a text about it's all celestial metaphor. That is not a literal historical event. But you're taking a text literally and saying, oh, they didn't commit genocide back then, so now they have to finish the genocide that they were supposed to do. Like, that is the most, it's clearly a genocidal text if you take it literally. But that would be as wrong as taking Jack and the Beanstalk literally, or Cinderella literally is not meant to be taken literally. But if you do, and then you apply those texts as it is being applied. You heard, I've made videos about Benjamin Netanyahu saying Amalek. Amalek. You're supposed to completely destroy Amalek. We're fighting against Amalek. Those are genocidal, literalistic interpretations, misinterpretations, fraudulent interpretations of a text that was not literal. Moses crossing the Red Sea is in the heavens. I can show it beyond any doubt. Moses with his staff that turns into a serpent, in the heavens, beyond any doubt. Moses being given the 10 Commandments and being told by God, I'm going to place my hand over the cleft of the rock, and then I'll go past and you can see my backside, my hinder parts, as it's translated in the King James Version. I've shown that is in the heavens. It's celestial. It doesn't make any sense if it's literal. God put his hand over the cleft in the rock so Moses could see his hinder parts. What? It's not literal. It's celestial. Those are all celestial markers, just as much as a woman with 9 children, and then they get thrown in a barrel into the sea. Those are all celestial. Moses getting put into the water. Baby Maui, who had 8 heads in some versions of the story. So you see the pattern. It's the same constellations here, being thrown into the water. These are celestial metaphor. You don't take them literally. But if you do take them literally, it's horrific. So I've had Christians tell me in all sincerity, after this horrific genocide has been going on for over a year, that, well, it's because, well, when they got the genocidal literal order back in the book of Exodus, they didn't fully carry it out. So that's why they have to keep carrying it out now. Whoa. That is morally bankrupt. But this is a U.S. genocide. Make no mistake about it. There's this term cat's paw. Israel is a cat's paw for the U.S. It means the paw isn't separate from the cat. In other words, it's not maybe the best metaphor, but Israel's doing exactly what the cat wants it to do. The cat being the United States. It's a U.S. genocide, and as a West Point graduate who knows what a war crime is and knows that perpetrating this is a war crime. A genocide is obviously a war crime, but wars of aggression are a war crime. That was established in the Nuremberg trials, that wars of aggression are a war crime. That's what's going on right now, is wars of aggression and genocide, and it's being not just enabled, but it's being planned and funded and ammunition supplied. You're not supposed to be able under all kinds of international law to be giving weapons to countries that are conducting wars of aggression or genocidal acts or war crimes. You're not supposed to be allowed to even give funding to that. This is a U.S. enabled part of U.S. policy by the criminals who've taken over the U.S. And it's the same as Ukraine. It's the same as the Ukraine. The bankruptcy of taking it literally is now on full display. The U.S. supporting this action, evangelicals who are Christians telling me that this is because, well, they didn't finish the genocide that was ordered when they went into the promised land the first time. Whoa. The Prime Minister of Israel citing Amalek and destroy the Amalekites. Genocidal. I made videos about that when he said it about a year ago, almost a year ago. I've been on record saying this, but it is on full display, and it is the bankruptcy of the hijacking of the West by people who collected up fairy tales, or the equivalent of fairy tales. Myth is different. It's on a different level than fairy tale. I'm not denigrating the ancient myths. The ancient myths are beautiful. They have something to teach us. Fairy tales have something to teach us. But they're not meant to be taken literally. Everybody knows that. And the ancient myths given to the world, they're there to teach you about the real principles of the invisible realm. And the gods and goddesses, you need to pay attention to those. But the West had gods and goddesses in Egypt, in Turkey, modern day Turkey, in Greece, in Norway, in the British Isles, in France, in Germany. The West had a received wisdom tradition with gods and goddesses. The modern hijacking created the misery of serfdom and the Dark Ages, and the church was right there enforcing it and collecting money during that and enabling this feudal Dark Age. And they sided when modernity started to break out in places like France, the church sat with the feudal powers against the revolutionaries in the French Revolution. The church was on the right, not on the left, in the French seating arrangement of right and left. The church is on the side of the feudal order of serfdom, and that's what was imposed. Now people will say, "Oh, but look at all the good that came out of Christian Europe. Mozart, Shakespeare." Well, Mozart and Shakespeare, did that require belief that there's a literal Jesus? Nobody can prove to me that whoever Shakespeare or whoever wrote those plays or whoever wrote Mozart couldn't have done it without literalist Christianity. We don't know. The fact is, we don't know what Europe would have been like if this hijacking had never taken place in the Roman Empire and the gods and goddesses of the Roman Empire replaced by this fraudulent creation of literalism. But we don't know what would have happened, but we do know what did happen. But now that basically lying system, and it was based on lies, it was based on a deliberate misinterpretation of the ancient texts. That system based on lies is now unraveling. It is now completely unraveling. Everyone can see the moral bankruptcy of what is going on in the Ukraine and in ancient Palestine, the lands of Palestine. This modern state of Israel that claims to be the Jewish state, that has its Jewish nationalism, that has different roads that you can only go on if you're Jewish, it has different legal status if you're Jewish or not Jewish, and is conducting an absolute genocide. And the videos, there's just so many videos that nobody can deny that they're blowing up schools and targeting hospitals and shooting journalists and shooting children in the head with snipers. Those are all war crimes, and anyone who's supporting that and citing literalist misinterpretations of the Bible to do so is rightly viewed as completely morally bankrupt. A system based on trying to justify that with biblical text is morally bankrupt, especially since all those texts can be shown to be celestial metaphor, just like the ancient myths around the world. There's a system of celestial metaphor. I've proven this beyond doubt. I've been writing about this for over 15 years now. It is proven beyond any doubt. And so we need to, when somebody starts telling you that they take a fairy tale literally, you need to say, look, I'm talking to you as a man to man. Don't come in here and start telling me about Mother Goose. Like, no way. Don't start coming in here and telling me about Jack and the Beanstalk justifies something. Let's speak as men or women. Let's be grown-ups. Those are misinterpretations of esoteric metaphorical texts. I've shown it. The fact that anyone is still saying that, still saying to me, well, it's because the Bible said every man, woman, and child. I said, are you serious? You think the psalm, there's a psalm that says, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. And it ends with, blessed is he who dashes the heads of their little children against the rock. You think that's literal? You think that's literal? It's not literal. The Bible is celestial metaphor, but if you take it literally, it's horrific. Everybody should see that. It's like taking a fairy tale literally. The people of the United States are culpable if we don't speak to our leaders and say, this is not okay. You're committing a genocide. That needs to stop. It can be proven to be based on a gigantic lie. No state has an inherent right to exist. The Confederate States of America did not have an inherent right to exist, and Abraham Lincoln brought about the end of the Confederate States of America and the slavery that they wanted to continue. It's the same thing. The state of Israel has no inherent right to exist. And it had no inherent right to this apartheid system and now genocidal system. You can't point to the Bible and say, well, there's my right to exist. Nobody can question it. No, I've shown that you can question it because this is a hijacking that happened to ancient texts to create this biblical literalism. And it is wrong. And it needs to be said over and over until the people wake up and put a stop to it.